Good morning, everybody, and welcome. Thank you for joining us here at our continuing series on the future of journalism in the age of AI. I think we've got a great session here today about a topic that's on everyone's mind, which is how to really make journalism better through the use of AI. And I'll begin just with a quick example. This semester, one of my students was working on an assignment where he had to look at the personal financial disclosure statement of a member of Congress. That member of Congress was April McLean Delaney, whose husband owns a bank, and therefore her financial disclosure statement was 31 pages long and extremely complicated. And my student came to me and said, "How am I going to make sense of this in a relatively short period of time?" And my response was, "Do you have a Claude account?" And he did. And we designed a prompt and put her disclosure statement into the prompt. And minutes later, we had a beautiful spreadsheet telling everyone how rich she is. So that's just one example of the kind of things that we're going to be learning today. Helping us do that will be Sean Mussenden, the director of the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism here at Merrill College, Derek Willis, one of the greatest data journalists in the country and a lecturer here at Merrill, and Eli Wohlenhaus, the director of digital AI news strategy at Adams Multimedia. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sean, who's going to begin.
All right. Thank you, Jerry. Let me just go ahead and get my presenter view up. Okay, folks. So my goal here in 10 minutes or so is to share with you 3 common pain points that reporters face in gathering newsworthy information. I'll show you how my newsroom and many others are using frontier generative language models and AI agents from major commercial providers to make these pain points a little less painful. And I'll also help you understand how to use them responsibly, providing an understanding, hopefully, of what they can do well and what they cannot. So, as Jerry mentioned, I run the Howard Center for Investigative Journalism. We're an investigative reporting unit and graduate training program at Maryland's Journalism School. And we do a lot of deeply reported, data-driven computation investigations. For the last 4 years, most of our work has involved the use of generative language models in some way. I also research and develop AI reporting tools under a grant from the Scripps Howard Foundation and partner with a lot of local newsrooms. So have a call out to look for people who are interested in working with us. My email's right there. Okay. So these are 3 common tasks that I face in my work, and I know other journalists do too. So things like I need to find interesting things in this massive document dump, and maybe I don't have much time to do it because I'm on deadline. Or to feed the need for civic information for my audience, I have a need to monitor lots of government meetings of interest. Or lastly, how do I, if I need to, obtain lots and lots of information of a similar type across the web? These are all pain points generally because they take a long time or a lot of people to do either quickly or well. So we're going to look at how AI can help us do these tasks. And help, by the way, is a key word here. These things can help us. They cannot do them for us. They can get us closer to the information we seek, but they really can't do it accurately or completely without our involvement. By the way, most of my work typically involves writing software or code to do a lot of these things I'm going to describe. But for the most part today, I'm going to try and give examples using off-the-shelf tools and things that non-coders can use. Okay. So finding interesting things in a massive document dump on deadline. So where I work, we do a lot of investigations in which the answers to our reporting questions are stored in mountains of PDFs. These are things we get through web scraping, big FOIA campaigns, sometimes leaks. And usually we're talking on the scale of thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of documents. Two common tasks that we have are to find or quantify examples of some pattern that is visible in the documents, or we can suss out of the documents that we may not already be aware of, or to identify a pattern that we may not already be aware of, or to find examples that exemplify that pattern. So the first task is something example finding. That's a classification problem, we'd consider it. And the second task, the finding patterns, is really more of a synthesis or summarization problem. So generative AI tools can be good at both. So I'm just going to show you a quick example. This is a story that one of our early career investigative journalists named Haley Parsley did earlier this year, published in the Washington Post. And there were some AI assistants involved with this. So to document the role of a specific high-profile police agency in the DC area, the U.S. Park Police, generally they do things like guard monuments, cooperating with ICE on arrests of immigrants. Was able to get the story by gathering and then going through hundreds of court records to find charging documents that made either direct or indirect reference to specific locations and to ICE. So, in the past, these kind of stories, a very common sort of journalism pattern, we would have done this through either manually reviewing a ton of documents or done keyword searching. Manual reviewing is obviously slow. It's a way to be more complete, but it's slow. Keyword searching will surface some, but not always all references. If a transcript or an extraction of text wasn't complete, or sometimes the references are a little obscure, or location might be only obvious by reading kind of a complex sentence as opposed to an address. Language models are good at these kind of things. We tend to write programs to do this, but I just want to show you a quick tool that has Google's Gemini under the hood that's really good for this sort of thing. So this right here is a tool called Google Pinpoint. This has been around for a while, and for those of you who haven't used it in a while, it really was designed to parse information in large document dumps. If it's been a while since you looked at it, what they've done recently is incorporated some really nice generative AI features into it. So what we were looking to do here with this document collection was to try and identify all of the documents that referred to this specific police agency and referred to arrests inside a certain geography. So Gemini, the chatbot here, has a nice little tool called Label Documents. I'll pull an example of something we already did. And we're writing a condition here: label all documents where the arrest occurred inside of DC and involved the U.S. Park Police, and then label it with a specific thing. So in about 30 seconds, it goes through and tags documents where that is the case. So allowing us to quickly get to that information. Okay. So from this, you noticed it flagged 11 documents. Could I just quickly go in and write a story saying, okay, we've had 11 examples of this happening? The answer to that is no. And the reason for this is there's a couple issues and limitations with these sort of language models. So one, it gets stuff wrong. These things are not perfect. It may have flagged something as either incorrectly being in DC or maybe incorrectly being inside or involving the Park Police. It may have missed one. So if we're saying there were exactly X number of incidents, we can't be sure. So we would need to go through the other documents. We could say there were at least this many after manually reviewing, ensuring there are no duplicated incidents. Why do this at all then? The value is it gets you to the information you need faster when speed matters, so that you can do a manual review more efficiently. Okay. So another example of a problem I would describe as monitoring lots of government meetings of interest to my audience. So many years ago, 25 years ago, my first journalism job was covering a handful of small town and county governments. For those of you who covered local government beats, you know that sometimes meetings are where Important news happens, and we write stories about that. But there are also great places to pick up little tidbits of information that could lead to a good story down the line. So let's go ahead and try and define the problem here. So the problem, as I see it, is uh, pretty much anywhere there are in a large enough area, there are going to be too many meetings and hearings and subcommittee meetings and zoning board meetings and council meetings where there just aren't enough journalists, not enough bodies or time to attend them all. And most of them, they go for a long time, and a lot of what happens there will not be particularly newsworthy. That was very true 25 years ago. It's even more true now. Fewer people. One positive development is a lot of these things are online, but that doesn't really solve the time problem. You still need people who are going to go through and like review these things. So, um, what if we could have AI help alert us to newsworthy things or keep up on developments for things we're just not going to attend? This is something, by the way, a lot of news organizations are working on this problem right now. Um, just a couple examples, and I'll be giving moderating a session at IRE if anybody wants to come on this in a few weeks. Hearst is building a tool called Assembly that is doing this for its newsrooms across the country, monitoring government meetings that are streamed online. So is McClatchy. The Philly Inquirer has a great one, and several others. This is also something that I've been working on under a grant with the Scripps from the Scripps Howard Foundation that Derek Willis and I are working on, where we're building a similar tool. So I will just show you an example here. So this is called the Meeting Watchdog, and I'm still seeking better names, but for now, that's what we're calling it. And so what this does is it ingests automatically meetings from YouTube and some other common civic streaming platforms across the country. You'll see here that we are have some meetings in Maryland where we're working with some news partners, and then Mississippi where we're also working with some news partners. One second here. And so what this does is it ingests the meeting, it transcribes it, it provides a summary of the overall meeting, and uses a prompt to extract what it considers to be the most sort of newsworthy or interesting things out of the meeting. Because it's not infallible, we also provide a rationale for why it selected something, including a direct link to the moment so people can verify it, and then other interesting items of notes, and you're able to search the transcript. Um, uh, does this actually work? Does it come up with interesting things? There's a lot of ways to test that. One way we're doing that is to evaluate what a human might have selected, say, in the same circumstance. We've done some formal experiments where it's matched human judgment in about 80% of cases. Okay. And one last thing to talk about here, which is the problem of needing to obtain similar information from lots and lots of places on the web. So at the Howard Center, we do a number of projects where we need to get, say, the same document, the same kind of police report or the same policy document from lots and lots of different jurisdictions. So say every county in a state or every county in the country or every state in the US. And sometimes we do this through big FOIA campaigns, really large scale web scraping. But a lot of times the documents are there on the web, and the value we bring is to find them, which isn't always easy, and to assemble them for analysis. The way we have historically approached this is to have a person or sometimes several people go out and search for a given county and then come back and do the next and do the next. It takes a long time. People hate doing this because it's extremely boring. We still have some layer of human involvement when we do this now, but what we're doing now is much more AI assisted. And that's because of the growth really in the last year of AI agents. So if you're thinking about Generative AI systems like ChatGPT or Claude or Google Gemini as really just chatbots where you have conversations with people. I want to say that sort of conception is probably about 6 months to a year really out of date. What we're seeing now and what is becoming available from all of these commercial model providers are agentic behavior built into the system. So what do I mean by that? Well, these are essentially like, think of these as like little robots who want to do your bidding, who are eager to do your bidding, or a very smart like team of interns who will take a task that you have, go out and find the website that hosts this document and bring it back and extract information from it and put it in a spreadsheet. These are now just common things that a lot of these systems can do. The real power here, by the way, is not just the ability to do that, which is something, but also the ability to do this at scale and speed. These aren't like working sequentially where they'll go to one site and then come back to the next one and another one, another one. You can run like 100 of these things at a time. And it means that tasks that once would take, say, days, now take a much shorter amount of time. In some cases, 10 minutes. So I'll give you an example of this. The other day, we needed to gather annual reports from a number of years for medical boards going across the country. We didn't want to spend hours looking at sites. So we got Claude to generate for us through a lot of this web searching. You'll see it searched 1,300 websites in 10 minutes and came back with a tidy spreadsheet with direct links to all of the reports that we needed. Or if it couldn't find it, it indicated that. Were these all correct? No. Were most of them correct? Yes. Did I have to go verify and check and make sure that they were correct? Yes. So why do this? Because the time it saved by providing me direct links on places and not having to do lots of back and forth searching was pretty measurable. So it gave us a major jump start on something that would have been typically a much longer task. Okay, that is my time. I want to leave you with two quick takeaways here. One is if you're interested in working with us on, say, hooking your newsroom up into our meeting coverage service, my email is right there. I'll put it in the chat. And the other is two kind of key takeaways. These are tools that get you closer to the information you need, but they're not good enough yet to completely automate things. The second is if it's absolutely critically important that you don't miss anything, as in you're using it to find as many examples of something as you possibly can, but it's okay if you miss something here and there. That's great because you can't always rely on these things to do everything. All right. Thank you,
Okay,
Jerry.
thank you, Sean. Derek, it's your turn.
All right, thank you. Let me just share my screen here. Okay. So as Jerry said, my name is Derek Willis. I'm a lecturer in data and computational journalism here. You can find a link to the slides on my first slide here. I want to talk today about sort of turning what is kind of everyday material, everyday newsroom material into more useful information. And mostly what that means is turning it from unstructured information into structured data. And so you might think like, ooh, structured data. Basically what I'm talking about here is maybe a spreadsheet, maybe a searchable or filterable web page, but sort of making something that you previously might have had to look at or maybe use Control F to find information that's useful and valuable for you, doing something better for that. Because while Control F was impressive to me when I was a college student, it should no longer be impressive to you as a way to find information. It should actually be the last resort. So let me give you a quick example, a very low-hanging fruit example of something I've done in working with the folks at the Frederick News Post here in Maryland. So they publish, when it's high school sports season, as it almost always is, they publish what they call the High School Hangout, which is just a simple but effective presentation of standings and statistics from various sports. This is from a fall sport period in last fall. They published this, they mocked this up as a PDF, and that's how it looks in the print edition of the paper. And also they publish it online as a PDF. And a PDF is not great for lots of reasons, but it's especially not good for publishing. And so they had the question of, could we make that, come up with a better option for that? And it turns out large language models are really good at taking one kind of information and restructuring it into another kind. And so I've written a little script now that with the assistance of AI, that now what happens is the news post can just drop a PDF into a folder. It gets converted into HTML by the script, and then you'll see on the right-hand side, there's a copy embed button where they can just literally copy the HTML and put it into their CMS. And so this is an example of like a low-hanging thing where we're dealing with information that the newsroom already has access to, already in their possession. They already made or control that should have better use and a better format, and so it has a better reach for audiences, right? This is a little more of a complicated example, but it's one that annoys me to no end, and I think is a classic example of how we've sort of come to accept Control F as like a reasonable way to find information. Again, this is Maryland specific. If you have if you participate in high school sports, if you have kids who participate in high school sports in Maryland, you may possibly have come across this, but it's a record book published by the State High School Athletic Association. And it lists, all kinds of records, but including like which schools have won or participated in state championship tournaments. This is an example from the girls lacrosse championships. And you can see there, essentially, if I wanted to figure out, like if Glen Elg or another high school or Leonardtown, when they had been in the state tournament, Control F is basically my only, the only way to do this here. But this is data. This should be in a spreadsheet. We should treat it like it's data and give it a nice home, which is in rows and columns, right? And so basically, this is the simple way to do this is to take the text from that PDF and upload it to a large language model and just ask it, hey, given the following text, extract the information into a CSV file based on a very simple example. I literally gave it 2 lines of an example, and it's able to go out and do that. And so I'll just quickly jump and be like, hey, look, here's the spreadsheet that it makes. As Sean mentioned, like, do I have to check this? Yeah, you should check this. But I think there are ways to sort of check this at scale. And there are ways that, for example, that we could do it programmatically to make it certain that, like, hey, if I see a team in here, were they really a quarterfinalist in that? After you work with these long enough and run some, sort of sanity checks, like there's a lot about these that work really well and provide really good, consistent answers. Hallucinations are always going to be a factor, always going to be a concern with language models, but they tend to do better when you give them something to work with and ask them to stay within the confines of that sort of environment. That's been our experience, at least. So I want to talk a little bit about a more ambitious thing here, which is a lot of our students here at the University of Maryland, when they graduate, if they've done the right thing and we've done the right thing, they might get hired as a reporter at a local news organization. When they show up, they are effectively filling in that blank space over there on the side of the screen, which is to say they're often showing up into a situation where they're being asked to cover a beat in a place that they have not lived in, that they do not really know about. And that was mostly a solved problem when I was their age, because when I was their age, there's a guy sitting in the corner of the newsroom who's been there for 30 years, might be named Jim, and you just say, hey, Jim, I don't understand this weird thing about the county council. Can you explain this to me? And Jim will be happy to do that. In a lot of cases, Jim is not there now. There is like not enough institutional memory, and in some cases, the reporters that are getting hired for entry-level jobs are replacing people who themselves maybe have a couple of years in the industry and have moved on. So how do we fill that gap? There's no real perfect way to do this, but we spent last fall as a class, one of my classes, trying to figure out if we could have the archives do this work for us, right? And essentially the idea here is that what the news organization thinks is important to know should be reflected in the stories that it publishes. And so if we could have the archives, work with the archives, they could probably tell us. So our students end up building, which is what we're calling a beat book, which is if you take archives and then you go and we build a system that processes those archives, extracts information from them, and uses that information to craft a guide. And so we are kind of beta testing this now. I will show you an example, a couple of examples from this. But the idea here is that you upload stories, some kind of content to it. We have written a series of prompts and use large language models to go and navigate that and that content and supply some judgment to those raw materials, right? And so like find some stories, we cluster some topics. You can kind of walk through and try to provide a consistent baseline for what you want. For example, we use embeddings, which is a very a long-standing technique working with linguistic corpuses with texts to group stories into buckets. Crime stories, immigration stories, education stories. And that way we can write beat books that address a single topic. And then we have the language model do that, goes out and finds that information, writes the beat book, and then adds some context from it. The context here is important because essentially, while a news organization will, its stories should be pretty comprehensive, oftentimes individual stories themselves are more, sort of incremental, right? But these language models often have been trained on a whole bunch of information that exists outside the context of a newsroom archive. That can help make this better, although right now we have it as an optional step in this process. So, and finally, I'll get this to you. I'll just actually skip out of this and show you, oops, sorry. Let me reshare here for a second. I just lost my screen there for a second. While we do this, all right, here we go. Okay. When we do this, what we do is we try to make it so that we come up with a product that describes for a reporter an area, a topic, a beat for them that also is based on existing stories from that archive. So for example, here's a story about a beat book about Talbot County over on the Eastern Shore of Maryland, that when it cites like demographics, for example, it, cites the stories that it gets that information from. And this becomes a browsable, like living archive in that sense. And that's what we're really seeking to do here. And that's what I think is one of the real opportunities with artificial intelligence, is that we could use it to make what we currently have better. And so what I'd like to suggest is here, for example, this is the Texas Tribune is working with us on this as well. One of their reporters has built like a pretty lengthy beat book on uncovering education policy in Texas public schools that covers a whole range of issues. And this comes solely from Texas Tribune stories. And so if you're curious, do we have if you have archives, I'd love to talk to you about that. So a couple of things I want to say about this. Right now, there's some room for improvement of this process with these beat books. The first is that we're using like commercial models to do some of the work here, and that costs some money. So for some of the beat books that we created, it might cost about $10 to create it, which Maybe you're like, that doesn't seem like that much, but if I'm going to do it for my whole newsroom, or if I'm going to update them periodically, like we'd like to make this as cost effective as possible. There are ways that we're experimenting with that we think could bring that cost down pretty significantly, right? Also, right now, this is a text-based thing. This is working with the text of stories, and we're thinking, well, yeah, that's fine, but there are obviously there are other news contents of news archives. There's audio, there's video, the images, the pictures that a news organization publishes are also important in telling the story about what's important to that community. And so we're looking for ways to actually bring those in as well. And so lastly, if you have some archives and you want to talk, like Sean said, in my emails on the slide, I would love to talk to you about it and experiment with you and work with you in terms of, maybe getting in a nice little feedback loop with that. But I think like what I really want to stress here is I really want to stress that these technologies are really good at working with existing data and making it better. And so that we don't have to live in an era where we're using Control F to find things. We can live in a place where we're actually able to like filter and sort and look at data that is actually data, even if it's presented to us as a PDF. And so I just want to leave you with that, like better things are possible with these large language models. And if you're interested in any of that, I would love to talk.
All right. Thank you, Derek. Eli, now it's your turn.
Excellent. Well, as I pull up my screen, I'll start by just saying Derek's one of the last things he showed was a beat book for Talbot County, which is something that is really relevant to us. So Adams Multimedia, I'll just quickly run through. I don't have very many slides. I'm going to do a lot of just talking to you all. Um, Adams Multimedia, we have newspapers in 21 states across the country. This is a helpful little map to show you if you see a red state outline, that's where we are. So what does that look like here locally? These are our properties. We're basically, if you draw a circle around the Chesapeake Bay, any county that touches the Chesapeake Bay, we're in it. There's a few exceptions to that. We got some special publications that cover that. So in Talbot County, we have the Star Democrat, and the beat book that Derek just showed was relevant because it pertained to that newsroom where our entire staff is under 30 years old. And that means, to Derek's point, that it's not just institutional knowledge that has changed hands from reporter to reporter, but you've got an editor who was recently in a position and can help out the reporter to their history there of only a couple years. So these are the things I just want to touch base on. So my job is the director of digital and AI news strategy, and how I got there was our VP of content of the company sent out some email about how AI was being involved in newsrooms, or how it could be involved in the media landscape. And I said, there's no way that this is going to work for a newspaper. I don't see how this could work. And boy, was I wrong and quickly converted. So, it's a new age technology. AI is new and it's fun and exciting. But you know what? For the most part, in a newsroom where you have fewer and fewer staff members, you can do some pretty cool old school things. So I've got first here listed as letters to the editor. For those of you out there who are in a newsroom still, you may receive letters to the editor that are handwritten from our audience members who are used to doing things that way, and you type it by hand. I know just a couple years ago, I was still doing that, typing news letters to the editor by hand. You don't have to do that anymore. You take a picture, you take a scan of that, you drop it into an LLM like Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT, and it will type it for you. Pretty basic stuff. Police logs and blotters. I know a lot of newsrooms across the country have gotten or no longer publish these, either at all or as frequently as they used to. And it's a type of thing that newspapers were once known for. You could go there, you could see everything. I know one of my first run-ins with a newspaper, I went to school for journalism, and I wrote for the student newspaper at college. But the first time I appeared in a newspaper was because I got a speeding ticket, so that's the kind of thing that doesn't appear in newspapers as often. But sure enough, that's my claim to fame in that small town in Missouri. Um, Real estate transfers are another thing that, you know, besides the fact that those are used to be printed where you could see all the different transactions. Sometimes it's good to research those things to see when business ownerships have changed. There are opportunities there. I put light editing on here. A way that I've used Claude, for example, is to ingest massive press releases where I don't need as much information as I'm sent from an organization or a business, and I just need to get a couple line items for a news brief. Sometimes you get big um, press releases from the like state police, for example, and depending on what your news operation is, you may have a newspaper that you publish that you don't have a staff member for, or you have one staff member for, and sometimes you can rely on an LLM like Claude to help you rewrite into AP style a press release that is something that you would normally do. And so something that might take you 10 minutes to do yourself or 5 minutes if you're really fast can now take you 30 seconds with the right kind of prompt. I put checker on here. So there's ways to check yourself and check your work beyond editing. I know that within the context of small newsrooms, if you were a one person operation, the old rule was you have at least two editors who read things. And as newsrooms have shrunk, I know among the first positions to go, copy editors, and has been community editors. And so as we are looking to integrate AI into newsrooms, the idea that AI is replacing people is not true, but in a sense it is because so many of our people in current day are doing the jobs of more than one, oftentimes more than two or three people. So sometimes you need an extra set of eyes on something, and that can be for silly things like grammar. I know as a Gmail user, our company uses Gmail. I found out that I do not write the way that the AI programs like for it to be. I'm not as succinct. I'm a little bit wordy, and I'm reminded by all the underlines in my emails every day. Um, but sometimes it's important. I don't write as much for in the newspaper sense anymore, but I write a lot of editorial style letters introducing people to special publications and things. And, those are a little bit less formal, and I still find myself, kind of losing the plot in my own writing. And I've found that LLMs can kind of help tighten it up a little bit for me. And the same can be true for if you want to check your facts and biases especially. Now, it's not the cleanest, as Sean and Derek have both stated, these tools aren't perfect, but in a lot of ways that we use them in our newsrooms is kind of almost like it's a red flag, or it's a raising of a hand and saying, hey, let's double check this. And that's kind of how you can use it. So I know that when our newsrooms were covering No Kings protests, for example, as a very hot topic. It's an important thing to cover because it's a very active community event. These things are happening. These things are going on. People in the community are attending them. But there's a lot of people who disagree that there should be any coverage, and they let you know it on social media. And so sometimes covering things like that, you want to make sure that when you're covering a protest and the people you're speaking to are at the protest, they all believe the same thing? Are you making sure your story is accurately representing it without seeming like you're just telling the story of their side of the issue? So that's a way that we've been able to use is to make sure that are we coming across the way we're meant to as a news organization and being an unbiased fact machine here. Brainstorming put on here, that's pretty open-ended. I've found personally that when I've wanted to understand something more, you can just have a conversation with an LM. What do you want to know? It going beyond just a beat book, for example, you want to know how to cover something, but sometimes you want to just get a feel for something. One of the fun parts of my job is traveling to newsrooms in different states for a company and just showing them how these tools work, how they can or can't use them, depending on what their newsroom needs. And I'm going into states, I'm going into cities and areas I've never been to before or have no understanding of. And I will use those tools to kind of help me get a little bit more information on where I'm going, what environment I'm walking into, what do I need to understand to best speak to this newsroom in particular. I put audio and video on here. That is that's the quickest changing thing. So all the other things I've mentioned are mostly text-based. That's AI has been doing that for a couple years now, and it's getting better and better at it. Audio and video is it's a tricky thing to navigate, I think, in our business, especially with newsrooms. For those reporters out there, editors, you may be in a situation where there's more pressure on you to be not just an editor or reporter who writes things and takes photographs. You're also might be encouraged to do video now. And what does that look like? How does that, help audience? Because we know short form vertical videos are kind of the hot thing right now and have been for a while and likely will continue to. So, what tools out there are there that we can use in an ethical way to represent our information? The key to what we do at Adams, and the most important part is that there's always, always, always the human element. So we've used tools where we've created podcasts or we've created video, and we use our content to create that video. So there's some tools out there where you can do that, and we've kind of experimented with a couple different ones. Some don't work. Sometimes we've put a lot of effort into something. We've created a podcast and it sounds like AI, and the audience numbers would agree that it sounds like AI and it's not interesting, even though it's built entirely off of what our human reporters have covered extensively with photo and story. So the last thing I put on there is data organization, and this has been where I've spent a lot of time lately. So we're in a world of analytics. You can get analytics for everything. If you have a personal social media profile, you can see analytics on a post you make after, going to dinner with some friends. In the world of newspapers, we're always trying to figure out where is our audience coming from? What do they want to read? What do they want to see? How do we better connect to what they're interested in? And so we get this information. We've got Google Analytics reports that come out every week. In our case, we have newsletters that get click to open reports. What kinds of stories are they clicking on? What stories that people are clicking on and they're hitting our paywalls, are they saying, you know what, this is worth me spending some money on. I'm going to buy a short-term subscription or a long-term subscription based on this article. We get data that has all this information, but where does it go? What do we do with it? For what I do is I've taken these reports and I've put them into an LLM, and I'm continuing to develop a long-term understanding of what content is working and what isn't. That's kind of simplifying it. But to do that myself, the amount of documents I'd have to look at and the amount of spreadsheets I'd have to self-create, that would be what I spend all my time doing. But I have so many different responsibilities besides what I do in the AI space. I have to do a wedding magazine. I have to oversee our military publications, among many other things. So being able to keep a conversation going where I'm developing a report with this LLM to determine what is the direction of our content, what do we need to focus more on as our resources are more limited, where do we put those resources? And so that's one of the key things. All of these things are about that as we have limited resources of our people. How can we maximize their time? And the goal is, can we bring old things back that were favorites of readers? Can we reduce our time on tedious, trivial tasks so that we can spend more time doing the important enterprise journalism? And with the data that we're getting and we're expected to understand, sometimes it's not as easy for us to interpret. I didn't do any kind of data classes in my journalism college experience. I didn't get any of that. I learned a lot about a lot of different things, but that wasn't one of them. So being able to rely on a tool to help me understand all of this information in a very short period of time and an easy to digest way is very, very helpful. So that's it for my presentation, Jerry.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eli. Now on to questions. If anyone in the audience has any questions, just please drop them into the Q&A and or the chat, and I will ask them. But meanwhile, before we get going with the audience questions, let me just ask all of you this. Are there any ways, and we'll go through all three of you on this, any ways in which you would absolutely warn people against using AI?
Well, since I'm unmuted already, I'll just say that I'm very much against using it to write for you. So Sean and Derek both showed some really cool tools that can organize information. And I know that we have ways to organize information. It could be very tempting on a busy week to throw in your meeting notes and the meeting agenda and say, Claude, write me something with 300 words. But that's not what we're here to do. At least in our newsrooms, that's not a bridge we want to cross. Another thing I'll mention is that we're very adamant that we're transparent in our use of it. Now, not every use of it requires transparency. There's some cases where you're doing research like you would on Google, and we don't ever put, and at the end of a reporter tagline, you don't put, our reporter Googled how to find most beautiful covered bridge in Maryland, but there are things like, if it does some heavier editing or organizational stuff, you might want to include that.
Derek or Sean?
So yeah, I would just echo Eli here. Uh, I feel pretty strongly that these things are not in a place yet where they can produce written content that can be published without some kind of human review. It really, these things to me are best used as ways to get us closer to information we need with less friction, and to speed up the time it can take to do tasks. But at some point, maybe they'll be reliable enough. But I certainly know we're just not there yet.
All I would add is, I mean, and I agree with both Eli and Sean's comments. All I would add is I would also not use it to do data analysis for you in the sense of like you upload a spreadsheet to Claude and say, please do some essentially non-trivial math on them. Like don't do that, because they will, like, yes, math has rules and you think it's a pretty safe area, but these are probabilistic prediction machines. The better strategy in those cases is have it write code that does the math for you, but do not actually ask it to like add up, summarize, like do data analysis on the fly.
Yeah, and just to echo there for Derek, have it write the code for you, but also have, again, the human layer of review still applies. You need a person who understands what that code did to review it, to make sure that it's actually doing what you think it's doing.
Okay, a question from the audience here. And this hope Derek is answering it, but I'll ask it anyway. Do you worry about hallucinations in the beat books?
Yeah, I definitely do. And I would say that during the class that we had last fall, when we first had students draft beat books, we were using non-commercial models. We're using what we're called open weight models that you can download and run locally. And we were doing that to sort of protect, like keep the full text of stories from reaching these commercial models so they could train on them, right? So good intentions, but the ability of those models to actually craft written material, as Sean has mentioned, is limited. And so they would do the job, like they would actually give you, here's a beat book. They would produce a beat book. And then I think the best and worst week was when I had the students fact checked what their models had generated. And yeah, they hated it because it was full of hallucinations, and some of them were like unintentionally hilarious, but a lot, I mean, just wrong. And so the what we tried to, sort of the best solution we found to that so far is that what we try to do is create metadata about the stories and use that, including like a summary, but also like key players, key dates, events, things like that about the story, from the story, extract those and use that to write the beat book and have rather than the full text. And that way we felt more comfortable using a frontier commercial model like Claude to do that. And those results were much, much, much better. So can I guarantee we'll never have hallucinations? No. And I think just like anything else, if you're reading a guide to a beat and it says some weird thing, you should probably check it out.
And as the
Oh,
recipient of one of those guidebooks, I can say that it was very solid information. Because even if you're newer to the newsroom, usually somebody has some experience and can look at that stuff and verify, yeah, this is true.
okay. A question for Sean here. What steps are involved in using agentic? Is it asking a series of prompts?
And so, yeah, and Derek or Eli, please jump in here. So the first thing to say is if you're using any of the latest sort of frontier models like on Claude, like you have access to like 4.8 max, by default, a lot of these things are going to behave in an agentic way, which is to take your prompt and then to loop through and think through. Different approaches to answering the question, test some things out. So in some ways, that's sort of an agentic behavior. Um, to use it in the way I was sort of describing it, which is to say, I have a series of tasks in which the step to execute the task is pretty similar for each thing it's trying to do. But the details of what website to go to or little hiccups might be different. I think actually the best thing to do is to start with a conversation to say, this is generally what I'm trying to do. But I'd like you, before you actually start doing this, to help me scope out instructions to you that give you really clear guidance on what to do and not to do. So you asked, is it asking a series of prompts? Yeah, I would actually start with a couple, conversations to refine it into something that is giving it really clear directions so that it's going to give you the best results. But once you agree on that sort of work plan, you want to just you can just let it go and execute it. And if you want to follow up with me too, Stan, I'd be happy to give you more examples of that.
All right. Now, if any of our audience members are kind of beginners here, if you could just all three of you reflect on the three major large language models out there and tell me your thoughts on the three and whether they have particular strengths or weaknesses.
Yeah, I can go first. Claude's my favorite. That's who I do most of the work with. And what's funny is I was a part of we put together a committee a couple years ago within our company to determine what uses of AI can exist. It was kind of just an exploratory committee. We talked through what we were trying out and testing, and we all determined that Claude was the way to go. But at the time, Claude was not connected to the internet, which was a huge change that happened late last summer where Claude got internet access. And what that means is when you were discussing with Claude or working on something with Claude, the information was trained on, but it couldn't go search it out in the web. So it can do that now and it's fine, but I still defer to Gemini for things like that, especially now. I feel like Gemini is a really good, it's Google, and Google tends to be where we go to search for information. I also like Perplexity, which hasn't been mentioned. Perplexity is kind of like a super Google if you want to do research stuff. I recommend using that tool. I tend to stay away from ChatGPT. I've always been kind of averse to it for some reason. It does some good stuff. I've done some cool things with it in the past, but that one I just tend to ignore.
Um, so first I would say all these models are extremely powerful, especially the latest generation ones. And there's actually they're becoming more commoditized than anything than in the past. And in my view, there's there are fewer differences and similarities in the underlying models. Where they start to differ is like, their ability to use different tools like web search or writing code, that you can use. When I'm doing one-off things, I tend to just use Claude. When I'm actually building a pipeline to like process lots of documents or something, um, I will generally test several different models at once, to see which has the best results for my specific task. And it's hard to know that in advance which one it's going to be. But I don't know. They're all pretty great now.
Yeah, yeah. I'm also like a Claude guy, but if you put me on a witness stand and, swear me in, like I'd say vibes. I don't know, like I like it. Like it seems to do things that I like
Yeah.
in ways that I like it, but like I do think it is important to like, kind of know what's out there and use things. I agree with what Eli said about Gemini in terms of Gemini's got some great abilities when it comes to like converting images, the text in images into actual text. Gemini also does some really interesting work with video, and they should because they're Google and they have almost all of YouTube to train on. So yeah.
Okay. I tend to think from my use of AI that the secret to using it well is learning how to develop prompts that are actually workable and that are less likely to produce hallucinations. So if the three of you could reflect on what would be some tips for how to do that?
For prompting.
Yeah, for prompting.
Yeah, so Jerry, I'm glad you brought that up. One sort of really interesting thing, and I actually think there's quite a bit of recent research on some of these models to back it up. Being able to write a good prompt, and being a prompt engineer, and there were some tricks early on where you'd like tell the models to pretend to be an accountant, so it was better at doing accountant. Um, those things have gotten less and less important over time. So what's actually happening with many of these things are when you initially write a prompt and it can be a poor prompt, it's actually doing its own, like trying to figure out what you meant and giving it better instructions, so that it can then proceed. So the actual skill of like, when everybody was going to be a prompt engineer for about a year there, that to me, I think is less important these days than like getting the basic idea out and then in conversation refining what it is you actually want. But Derek and Eli, I'd be curious to see if that's your impression too.
Yeah, that's my I agree. I think the one thing I would add is that we used to think, or at least I used to think about this as sort of uh, that humans, that people, we would design prompts sort of in our own image because we had human problems that we were asking computers to solve, which
Mhm.
makes some sort of logical sense. I think because these are software, because these language models are software underneath the hood, uh, I think actually having the models themselves like assist in writing prompts is actually a good thing. And I know a lot of folks who kind of swear by essentially taking a stab at prompts, but letting models actually kind of craft or refine those prompts. And so I would say, and you might think like, well, that seems like, kind of seems weird because you're asking the thing that you're asking to do the work to actually tell itself what to do. But if you feel bad about this or weird about it, like ask a different model to refine the prompt. I mean, like,
Yeah.
and then transfer it over. And see, but you should think about these things as uh, like interactions to these things somewhat in the same vein that we think about interviews, which is to say that like almost all of us don't ask like one question and leave it at that, right? And so like have very varying ways to ask questions and a whole plan for asking questions. And I think if we approach it that way, and we're pretty well suited to do that as journalists, then I think we'll probably be better for it.
Yeah, I think one of the main things that I remind people as I'm teaching them how to use these tools is that I find a lot of people who have dabbled, as they say, in AI will tend to try something and it doesn't work the way they want it to and they give up. And the thing to remember with these conversational AI tools is if it doesn't work for you the first time, ask it a different way. Or, like Derek said, ask it for help on how to ask it. I'm at a point where I've been using Claude for so long for so many things. It has memory, which is pretty cool to have that built in, especially if you're in a newsroom. If you have a task you have to repeat over and over again, you don't have to prompt it the same way. Just like I said about a year ago, we were really concerned with, or we really appreciated that Claude was not connected to the internet. We also were really concerned that we had to have a really rigid, strict prompt each time we started a task in a new conversation. And that's just not how it is anymore. Just to Sean's point that you pretty much can get what you want, especially as you build those things over time. So Claude knows me in my position. It knows that I train newsrooms. If I were to open a chat right now and say, "Hey, I'm speaking with the University of Maryland on a AI and news gathering conference," it probably would say hi to you all because I've done that before in one of my sessions with our newsroom. So, yeah.
Okay, great. We have run out of time. We could keep going forever on this because it's such a rich topic, but we should go. Thank you all very much thanks to our panelists and thanks to our audience. Please join us next time on July 19th for our next session with our UMD colleague Ron Yaros talking about new ways of reaching readers. All right, we will see you next time. Thank you all. Take care.